It's the climate cause. Today's show is brought to you in partnership with the Ecological Design Network. Ecological Design Network utilizes regenerative resource management to design and develop natural production systems for combating the most pressing climate problems. Working with individuals, communities, and commercial sectors, they have a design package ready for anyone looking to create a positive change. To learn more about the difference they can help you make, visit www.ecologicaldesignnetwork.com. Hello and welcome to the Climate Cause. I'm here with Jonnie Hogenstad, and we are excited to talk climate and environmentalism and all that good stuff today. Welcome, Jonnie.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So you're calling in from Seattle, Washington.
Yeah.
How's the Monday going today?
Going pretty good. Just good old rainy Seattle day.
Yes, I'm here in Portland, and we have very similar weather.
Yeah.
It's been a really weird spring here. I'm assuming up there too, super rainy.
Yeah.
And then one day of 80-degree weather.
Yeah, it's been cold. I thought it'd be warming up by now, but
yeah, but there's this thing called climate change that might play a factor.
Let's get into it.
Yeah, so let's get into it. So you have a degree in environmental studies from the Portland State University. How is that informed what the work you do, and hold on, sorry, what is the question? What is the work that you do as an environmentalist as a result?
Yeah, so I think I was very lucky to go to Portland State because it was a really good perspective on integrating an environmental study into an urban setting. So it was a really cool way to be on Portland State campus. It's downtown in Portland. So it's very much just blends right into the downtown area. So studying there, I got to live there for a little bit on campus, and then just as a commuter as well. It's really cool to be able to go to a school that's in such a busy downtown area and then walk 10 minutes out into a park and then be researching soil composition and macroinvertebrates. And yeah, it was a really cool introduction into what environmentalism looks like, because it's not always just cut and dry. You got to be out in the forest fighting fires or researching trees or whatever. It's there's a very important way to do it in an urban way. So yeah, I got the best of both worlds from studying there, and then going past that, I think that really informed my desire to be an environmentalist in an urban setting, because frankly, just that's where the people are and that's where it matters for the most part. Not to say that everything happening in more rural areas is not equally affecting everything else, but I think just the exposure for people, even with your podcast, is just exposing the normalities of what it is to be an environmentalist and contribute to fighting climate change. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, anyway, I got to study there, and then I've lived in a few different cities. I lived in Philly for a little bit, and now in Seattle, and just seeing the different ways that you can contribute to greening a city, has been really interesting. And it's just such a vast perspective change going from the West Coast to the East Coast as well. So yeah, through all that, and then through the pandemic as well, being in the large city in the pandemic, it's just all very informative into what I would like to do eventually. But yeah, I mean, at the end of all of that, the thing that has really gripped me for a couple of years now is starting a kelp farm, which is the process I'm trying to roll out as soon as possible here in the next year, and ideally do that as close to an urban setting as possible.
Right. And that sounds that has a lot of overlap for you, of the potential of not only understanding this ecological resource that we have, but also the way that it can integrate with the urban setting and a lot of like our natural systems that it sounds like you've been able to study and observe, like living in a specific built neighborhood or urban environment, and how there's so much that's interconnected to that, and how
Mm.
you can bring those together and have a solution that fits your interests as also has an impact.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Were you always interested in environmental like studies or environmental science? Would you always say you've been an environmentalist, or have the
Um,
past couple of years really been catalysts for you?
yeah, I mean, I think being environmentalist is such like a spectrum.
Mhm.
But growing up, I definitely had like my parents were very, just classic as like not really knowing what climate change and environmentalism is as a kid. My parents were very focused on like eating healthy and like recycling and being connected to nature as much as possible. Um, but yeah, and then going into college, I think that's when you get your own perspective of everything. And yeah, I pretty quickly realized how important it is to like, just research and know what's happening and what you can do to like make a difference. And what you can do, like, because I think that's so like multifaceted in the sense that like, it's not just like you have to be an outdoorsy person to know how to like help your environment. I think it's like very rooted in like government and like law, very rooted in like social change. Even just like the last few years, how much like the internet has influenced everything. So yeah, I'd say like definitely I was lucky enough to grow up in a place that's very like, drive 10 minutes any direction and you're kind of in the middle of the woods. So that's helpful, but that's just such a different aspect of what it means to be an environmentalist. It's not just about being able to like get in the outdoors and be comfortable. It's about like focusing on real change in cities and like getting people exposed to it and fighting and lobbying and all this other stuff. So I had like one perspective of it that I'm very grateful for, but I think growing up and going to college and getting more exposure from all sorts of different people, it's like definitely changed my perspective on like what it means and how you can make a difference kind of thing.
Totally. And even just like listening to you speak, like ignited a new neural pathway for me thinking about the situation that we're in, because it sounds like a lot of your upbringing was about like recognizing and valuing nature and the environment for what it was and like how it enriched your life around you. And then you went to college and started learning and studying more about like the impact of our world on the environment. And there's a huge difference between hugging a tree and like radically changing the way that we like cut down trees and
Right.
create all the resource, like harvest all the resources that we need for society. And
Yeah.
so I can definitely relate into that like transition of like, okay, well, I'm recognizing and valuing the earth so much that I realize that there's an even more complex, or even like an even more intentional system that we need to like adopt in order to change the way that our world is working, so that we can still hug those trees and still enjoy nature.
Yeah.
It can't really necessarily be one without the other,
Yeah.
unfortunately, given the situation that we find ourselves in 2022.
Sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned you mentioned the kelp farming. I was
Hmm.
hoping maybe you could go into like a little bit about that, like what that entails and the impact that it has. Um,
Yeah, I'd love to. I could definitely talk about that for hours.
Woo!
Yeah. So it's a really, I mean, I'm not like the expert, and I haven't really gotten a chance to get it started yet, but
Mhm.
I have just like researched the heck out of it, and it is a huge passion of mine now. But essentially, at the root of it, it is a kelp farm is a suspended like 3D farm that you have in the ocean. So it's a very simple system of just like suspending kelp from rope about a mile or two away from the shoreline in like intertidal kind of waters. And the coolest thing about it, I mean, there's a million cool things about it, but the coolest thing is like a zero input farm. So really all you have to do is just grow this kelp, and you don't fertilize it. You obviously don't add any water because it's growing in the water already. And it's really just, as far as like, all of the studies and research I've done, it just seems like the most sustainable form of farming.
Mm-hmm.
um because again, you're not adding anything to it, you're not also taking away any land or anything, because the process is that you just lease the land from the state or the city, depending on where you are, and you're not purchasing that land, so you don't own that land, so you're not taking any land away from anybody. People can still fully recreate on it, swim on it, do whatever they want. It's just the crop is what's yours, essentially. um and yeah, it's the idea is that you can, like, hopefully in the long run do a million different things with kelp, because it's definitely a large industry in other continents, especially Asia, obviously, and then here it's just like a bit of a growing industry, but not quite to that point yet.
Mm-hmm.
um but hopefully, one day it can be like an excellent food resource, but it could also be like some form of biofuels. It could be used for feed for cows, which like significantly reduces methane that's released into the environment. Because cows really shouldn't be eating as much corn and stuff as they do. So it's like a much healthier resource for them. You can use it in like daily products like cleaning stuff, makeup, hopefully a million other things. It's just like in the preliminary stages of researching it for whatever you can use it for.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it just seems really cool. I've been really stoked about the idea for a couple of years now, and like it's really stuck with me, and how cool of a resource it can be. And I really love the idea of like the farm side of it, but I also really love the idea of like the social aspect of it. Because living in Seattle, it's just like an incredibly cool resource to have the Puget Sound right here. Um, and having something like that accessible to people in an urban setting is like the coolest idea ever, because typically people are so disconnected from their food resources, that they don't really think about like where it's coming from, like how much it takes to transport it across the country or across the world, and being able to like show people that this is like a type of farming that A is like zero input and like very sustainable. B, it can just be grown right on your front door, in Seattle, especially, like it can just be like a resource that's right here. Um, and yeah, it doesn't have to go, 1,000 miles to get to you, kind of thing.
Right. And also too, from like the carbon footprint, environmental impact perspective, you're saying it has no impact, or there's zero input in the actual harvest or production. Excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze.
Yeah. Bless you.
Okay, that just happened. Thank you. Yeah, there's like a very low impact financially, in terms of the impact or the input that you're putting in. And then in terms of the ways that you were highlighting the benefits of, I want to say land use, but it's a water use, but that
Mhm.
you're saying people can continue to recreate and utilize this resource, that the water that we have as we normally have. I think that this kind of thinking symbolizes or is a really good example of how we can radically change the ways that we produce the products that we use every single day. You
Right.
talked about food, you talked about energy, you
Mhm.
talked about everyday products that we're all really familiar with. And the potential, I get just really excited to think about that, the potential to replace our status quo consumption with something that is already off the bat lower impact, local, and connected to the earth in a lot more natural way of using natural cycles. We've interviewed other podcast guests who have used like ecological processes to radically change farming, to radically change the like systems around them. And I think this is another one of those examples of how a product and your insight into environmental systems have shown you that like this is a very viable solution that maybe is overlooked because not a lot of people know about it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How
and I
did
think like what I was discussing too, just where like it's in terms of like the like human centric approach to it, and the benefits that we would get, but also the other thing that I didn't mention really is that it's like kind of the cool thing about the crop is like it is a climate change reverser instead of adding to like more like input and output into the environment, because like typically, and the cool, the thing about like soy products or whatever, like we use that in a lot of like daily products as well, but that is just such an intensive crop, and like it's just kind of adding to monoculture and taking up a ton of land to do that production. Whereas kelp is like, again, a zero input thing. It also soaks up ideally like 10 times more carbon than any land plant can do. So it'll kind of reverse like ocean acidification if it's like, if we're lining our entire coastline with kelp farms. Because again, it's so non-invasive that it shouldn't really affect too much in terms of like visually or
right?
spatially. Um, and it creates like really, really good habitat for a lot of critters in the ocean. And it's like having it in an intertidal zone, it protects against like storm surges. So when like waves are like massively coming in, it can kind of counteract the amount of like sediment that is stirred up in there and like pushed more towards our coastlines. It kind of just like balances it out a little bit. So there, there's like really, really great like social impacts from it, but there's also like incredible environmental impacts from it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, holy kelp, that is
Nice.
amazing. That's like
Yeah.
you just provided like a laundry list of like solutions to one of like the most pressing issues that we have environmentally or climate related.
Yeah.
Ocean acidification is like huge, especially in terms of the fact that we have so much carbon going into our system all the time, into our ecosystem, or what's the word, atmosphere, all the
Mhm.
time.
Right.
But that piece you were talking about it being a carbon sink, kelp
Yeah.
being a carbon sink, I think that um that's something you don't hear a lot about. We hear a lot about cutting our emissions and reducing consumption, but we rarely hear about the solutions that are even bigger tools in our tool belt to utilize natural resources to further like our to factor that into our climate change solutions. And I'm really stoked that you came onto this production today and we're able to share that, because I for one had not really thought about the endless impact that kelp has, just on a local but also regional and sounding like national and international and global scale, like
Yeah.
mm. So yeah, and especially having that power to have that impact from your locality, like near Seattle, for sure.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. That is like the dream to have it. Because, like having something like that, that would be such a eye-opening resource, as far as like what it can do for the environment. Would be so cool to have it so close to a city where you could like, do field trips for kids or whatever and have them come learn about like what not only what kelp farming is, but what it means to like impact your environment and how to like do different kinds of things, especially so close to a city, because that's where a lot of like our carbon emissions are coming from. Um, Having something that shows how we could potentially reverse that, and just like, beside like the whole climate change thing, just exposing inner city kids to like food resources and just the environment in general is like a really cool resource, because not a lot of people get that. And that's the coming from like my perspective from Philadelphia. um it's just not as much of a common idea to like connect yourself to nature, um which isn't necessarily like the point, but it is nice to be able to like connect yourself to like food resources and growing your own food and getting out in the ocean. It's just all that stuff like really makes a difference, I think.
Totally. And especially on those small scales, I feel like when I go outside, I like am way happier, especially when I come back inside and it's like you don't really recognize while it's happening, but you realize over like the course of your life how impactful be getting outside and having that connection to nature is. And I speak about this like coming from like California, where I've been fortunate enough to like go to the ocean and the mountains, and you growing up in Southern Oregon, like there's a lot of mountains, a lot of waterways. I think that that's a really good message to like really encourage people, no matter like what their definition of like getting outside is or what is accessible to them, like really encouraging that. And it sounds like you're able to like see a very clear vision on how that can positively affect those in the Seattle urban area.
Yeah, big time.
How did you learn about kelp, like, and the potential that it has?
Yeah. So I read a book. It's just one book that kind of like roped me in. It's kind of by this dude who's basically like the godfather of like, you know, kelp farming in America. His name is Bren Smith, but he wrote this book called Eat Like a Fish. If you haven't heard of it or anything, check it out. It's like one of the, you know, I mean, for me, it just like totally changed my course of what I want to do. But yeah, he grew up as like a commercial fisherman. He was from like Newfoundland, and you know, did it for, you know, 20 years, 10, 20 years just fishing. And he kind of saw like the detrimental impacts of commercial fishing, and went through like the tanking of certain fish, and how that impacted like not only environment, but mostly for, you know, fishermen, it's impacting their jobs. So once they run out of that resources, they're just out of luck and can't really fish the same fish once it's like becomes a protected species, or they just literally like completely wipe out most of a species of fish. You know, they can't fish it anymore. So it was mostly, I think, originally from his perspective, was the idea that like we can't just keep overfishing, because it's going to become a lost resource, and it's going to cost like literally tens to hundreds of thousands of jobs. So the alternative is to grow that resource, you know, where it's like a completely sustainable returning resource, which being kelp. And yeah, he, you know, I recommend reading the book. He has a ton of podcasts that he's been on that he talks about it very, very clearly, and it's like super easy to follow. And there's a lot of like scientific research on it as well. But yeah, it's just like I think the idea was, yeah, to create something that can not only supply jobs for a lot of people, but something that ideally will never, you know, become a lost resource, or an unfarmable resource, because it's just completely renewable, and then it keeps coming back, and then also it's doing so much good for the environment, instead of like taking a massive boat out in the ocean and, you know, using a bunch of fuel and a bunch of like resources to catch these fish and then killing them all. Instead, you grow something that comes back all the time, and it's also, you know, helping the environment in a multitude of ways.
Totally. And it's using that like ecological intelligence of understanding how that system works and introducing a solution, rather than just guessing or going with status quo.
Yeah, right.
How to solve that issue. Cool.
Yeah, that was the origin for me.
Totally. And would you say that the pure environmental and social impact is what motivates you, or what would you say, like, you would say is your chief motivation in the pursuit of the kelp farm?
Yeah, I mean, that was something that I've like, excuse me, going to school and learning about the different like facets of, I guess, is environmentalism in general, but like environmental studies, it roots itself in like mostly like soil research and water research, air research, and all that. And that wasn't super interesting to me, but something that was always incredibly interesting was like food resources, and how our food is grown, and how impactful it can be, in positive and negative ways. So that has always stuck with me. And then learning about, you know, because I know, because part of it is that like using farmland as a land resource is, you know, it's a requirement, obviously, and the livelihood of like a ton of people, but it is also very impactful in terms of like just taking land, you know, and changing it for what it is, and that land becomes like private, which, you know, is not always like the best thing in the world. And typically the way we farm now, especially in like massive farm settings, like the whole factory farm thing, is just like pretty out of date. You know,
Right.
it's just like there's just got to be another way to do it, because there's so much waste, and so much like so much of it is that shortly here it seems like it's going to be unfarmable land as well, especially with like monoculture farming. It just is destroying the soil, and we're going to have to either like continue our like scientific GMO research to change the way we farm and change the food we eat entirely, or we just find another way.
Yeah, or we like use the natural way that's already around us that we've been kind of
Ideally.
ignoring a little bit because
Exactly. Yeah. You know, there's ways that people have farmed for thousands of years that has been completely sustainable and come back, and then yeah, we're just changing that and kind of decimating it a little bit. So yeah, so yeah, again, I've always had like a little bit of an interest in like in food in general and how that impacts the environment, and always had a dream of like owning my own farm, or at least like massive garden to sustain myself and also sustain hopefully other people. um so yeah, the idea that came with that for kelp farming was that it's like a very accessible thing, it's very affordable, and it's just like an incredibly, you know, like I mean, another thing is like the ocean has always been like incredibly fascinating to me too, just because like we know quite a bit but we don't know like that much at the same time, you know, so there's like so much to it that is still like a lot to learn, and stuff that we'll never learn, you know. It's just like a fascinating idea to me. So having an entire farm that's completely underwater, uh in a completely open water space is like just the coolest thing in the world to me.
absolutely. So if you're not, you know what they say, if you combine your interests with your work, you'll never work a day in your life.
Yep.
So I
This is
think
the
that's
way.
the biggest goal too. And I think that's something that I love the most about the work trends and people becoming aware of their own power is like trying to find something that ignites them, has a social or environmental or ecological or some sort of impact.
Mhm.
And so that you can like keep your soul and maybe your wallets alive, you know, and so we
Right.
can keep this going. But Jonnie, like this sounds like an awesome idea and also like a lot of real scientific evidence and like intuition that you have going with it. So I really am stoked that not only were you able to share your ideas here on this podcast, but also being able to continue on and like I will definitely follow this your process as that going. You said that you wanted to kind of get some wheels turning by the end of the year.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm hoping, I think the, you know, the planting season kind of runs from like November to May.
Okay.
And I think, you know, for me the most like not necessarily confusing, but like the longest process, it seems like it'll be the leasing, like working with the state to get the actual space to use and finding out the right space to use it. Because you know, as I said before, I think the coolest thing for me personally and like the ideas I have with it would be to do it in Seattle proper, or as close to it as possible, just to create a resource for like not only for it to be so close to a city, but also just to like, you know, show that that can be done in a very urban setting, but also just to create the resource for like kids to be able to come see it, for like any city person to be able to come out and see it, to create jobs for inner city people, um, you know, just being able to do that like in Seattle like proper, or any Seattle like city proper area would be the absolute dream for me. But yeah, I think, you know, once we figure out like where it's going to go and how to permit it and everything, then yeah, I think dream is have it up and running by November this year, and
Cool.
then just get it going.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely gonna keep in contact and I want to keep everyone updated with the development. I think one
Sweet.
element I want to do at some point is like go out and do site views of these really cool
Definitely.
projects people are working on. I would love if you wanted to be one of the sites for that because I
Yeah.
think that no matter what, no matter like how your project like ends up blooming, like it has so much potential for impact. And so
Yeah,
thank
for
you for
sure.
I mean, like just like following that like gut feeling, you know, on like
Mhm.
how you want to make the impact. I think that there's a million especially with so much ambiguity around climate action and what that looks like.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just got to trust your gut. And even if the world around you is saying like it might, you know, there might not be an exact path clearly lit. It's like, okay, I'm going to follow my gut and know that like I know what I know, and especially backed by like the ecological systems that you have on your side. I
Yeah.
wish you the best of luck, and I thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. This has been
Yeah,
awesome.
for sure. Thanks for having me. I'm stoked to
Yeah,
talk about it. The more exposure, the better.
exactly. Do you have any final comments or want to say goodbyes to the crowd?
Yeah, I mean, no, not specifically. It's stoked to be here, but you know, just it's for the people. And it's definitely like I'm just a normal dude, like not really doing anything specific. So just cool. I just would love to like get the kind of exposure out there that it's like you don't have to be studied or like environmentalist to be able to do stuff like this. You know, it's just like any little thing always helps. And yeah, that's all I got.
That is the best, most amazing note to end on, Jonnie. I too am just a human being, a gal with a computer. Thank goodness, very grateful for my computer that I can press start and stop and know how to edit. So
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining and listening. This has been another episode of The Climate Cause. All right. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.